Some time ago, when the internet was abuzz with the claim that Bill Gates was the biblically prophesied Antichrist, I put together a response just examining this claim, and I concluded that there was really no way Bill Gates could be the biblically prophesied Antichrist. This has caused some people to contact me and say, then who do I think is the Antichrist, or was the Antichrist, or who will be the Antichrist? And that's what I want to respond to today. The checklist, the biblical checklist for identifying the Antichrist. The book of Revelation is grounded in Old Testament language. It's grounded in the Old Testament language of the book of Daniel, book of Zechariah. It contains a lot of references to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. It's clearly got references to other prophetic instances in the Old Testament. And when it comes to Revelation chapter 13, there's some very clear allusions to what the prophet Daniel prophesied, where he prophesied about beasts, which he said were world emperors, and that these world emperors would arise at a certain period of time. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream during the time of Daniel, where he dreamed of a statue with a golden head, a silver arms and chest, and a bronze midriff, and iron legs, and then feet made of iron and clay. And Daniel interprets this, telling Nebuchadnezzar that the head of gold was actually him, which would have been quite flattering for Nebuchadnezzar. But as it goes on, he goes on and explains that we then have the Medo-Persian Empire, we then have the Greek Empire, which divides into 4, and then from out of that will come the Roman Empire, and then the feet of iron and clay, ultimately we can see will be the mixture between Rome and Jerusalem. And then in Daniel chapter 8, he makes further reference to the Roman Empire, going again through this succession of world empires. And he says from out of the Roman Empire would come a ruler, a very arrogant ruler, who would go into the precious land. He would go into the precious land being the land of Israel. And of all of these rulers, it was indeed the Roman Empire that conquered. When Pompey went in sometime before the birth of Christ and conquered Jerusalem and went into the temple and conquered the whole land. And then Rome set up what was in essence a puppet king, that was King Herod. So we see the references in Revelation chapter 13 are referring to this biblically prophesied event. So when we go through the checklist for identifying the first beast in Revelation chapter 13, the beast from across the sea, exactly the same language as the book of Daniel, it's pretty clear that Daniel's referring to the Roman emperor at the time. So the checklist includes, firstly, it's prophesied in Daniel as being Rome, the Roman Empire. Secondly, in the book of Revelation, it's identified as being the 5th seal. And we know that because when we look at the 5th seal, that's when the martyrs cry out, and the beast is responsible for martyring. We can see that later on in the book of Revelation. And this is identified in Revelation chapter 6, verse 9. We then see the next thing on our checklist for identifying who the beast is it's identified by the original audience with the gematria of 666. And gematria was essentially where letters have a numeric value. And the numeric value of Kaiser Neron, was 666. So we can see that ticks off as well as being around the same time as the book of Revelation was being written. And then we can see in Revelation chapter 17:10 on our checklist that it's described as the 6th king of the Roman Empire. And of course we have the first Roman king being Julius, then we have Augustus, then we have Tiberius, then we have Caligula, then we have Claudius. And in Revelation chapter 17 verse 10 it says 5 have fallen. So those 5 kings of Rome were dead, and one now is. And the one now is the 6th king of Rome, who was Nero, Caesar Nero. And then we have, it's described through the rest of the book of Revelation as the beast. So the beast identified as being from across the sea is referred to the rest of the book, in the rest of the book of Revelation, as being the beast. And we see an example of this in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 8. And then in Revelation chapter 20, we see that the beast and this other character, which we'll come to in a moment, the false prophet, is identified as having their doom at the same time. So they will be judged at the same time. Their demise will happen simultaneously, around the same time. And then we see that the beast is distinguished from the dragon, who is identified as Satan, who's ultimately behind the plot. And then we have the false prophet, who's also distinguished from the beast. But the beast is not identified as the Antichrist. And that's because when we go to the checklist for the Antichrist, it's not possible that this beast could meet the criteria. So the beast in Revelation chapter 13, the first one, the beast from across the sea, is pretty clear. We can establish who that is. But then the second beast is described as being from the land. Now, when we look at the criteria for the Antichrist, we can see that there's not just the book of Revelation who identifies this character, but what we can see is that it must correspond at the same time as the Roman Empire, because of what we saw from the first beast, because the first and the second beast have a relationship. The second thing we see is that there's cooperation between the Roman emperor and the second beast, the beast from the land. And we see in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 42 that both of these, because they're described as iron and clay, they will both be destroyed by the Messiah. So they are both simultaneous to the Messiah. We also see that because it's identified in John's writings as the Antichrist, the one who withstands Christ, that the Antichrist must have been at a time when he could have opposed Christ. In fact, the Antichrist would have been responsible for calling for the death of Christ. That's the ultimate standing against Christ. And we see that there was someone who was responsible for this, and that was the high priest. The high priest called for the crucifixion of Christ, the Messiah. And then we see that the Apostle Paul identifies this person as being a man of lawlessness, which is really a play on words, because the high priest was supposed to uphold the law. And Paul says, because the high priest had rejected Christ, he was a man of lawlessness. We see this in 2 Thessalonians. And then we also see in 2 Thessalonians that Paul says he will take his place in the temple. Now that clearly means that he had to be around the time when the temple existed. And the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So identifying who the Antichrist is someone who had to exist during the time of the temple, because when the readers heard Paul say that, they clearly understood what he meant. It would have been the temple in existence in Jerusalem at that time. It also says that he takes his seat in the temple. That's something else that Paul said. So again, it requires that the Antichrist was in existence prior to 70 AD. When the book of Revelation identifies that both the beast, which I'm identifying as Nero, the Caesar of Rome, and the second beast, who will be identified as the false prophet, who is later identified as, in Revelation chapter 17 verse 1, as the great prostitute, and then in Revelation chapter 18 verse 2, and Revelation 17 verse 5 is also identified as Babylon, where it says that this is where the prophets, the apostles, and the saints or believers were killed. We see that Jerusalem and Rome had they were colluding against Christ, and when it says in Revelation chapter 20 that they were both thrown into the bottomless pit, in other words, they died. There's no return from this. Both the high priest and Caesar Nero died roughly about the same time. Caesar Nero died in 68 AD, and the high priest in existence, in fact the last high priest in existence, died in 70 AD when the Romans finally invaded Jerusalem and put to death all of the priests, including the high priests and the chief priests. In other words, all the candidates for the office of high priest were executed at that time. So when you look at the checklists, we see that the first beast, the beast from across the sea, had to be in existence around the time of the writing of the book of Revelation. And that's partly because when you look at gematria, we see that his number, John tells us in Revelation chapter 13, verse 18, with wisdom could be identified. That same expression, this calls for wisdom, which means you can know who this is also the expression used in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 10. So in other words, the original readers in around about 65 AD, during the tribulation, John tells us in the opening chapter, they could identify who he was referring to. And indeed we see the collusion between Rome and Jerusalem against Christians. What we also read prophetically in the book of Revelation is that Rome would turn on Jerusalem. Rome would turn against the Jews, and indeed they did. The siege of Jerusalem began in 66 AD, and Jerusalem was eventually destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. And so who's the Antichrist? The Antichrist would have been the high priest. This is another reason why Bill Gates is not the Antichrist, and neither is anyone else yet to come. Now, does that mean there won't be people opposed to Christ? Of course not. Of course not. But it means that Revelation chapters 1 to 19 have been fulfilled. We're now living in Revelation chapter 20. For more information on the book of Revelation and articles that deal with these matters, please go to my website, andrewcorbett.net. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please subscribe. And each day I upload a fresh daily Bible reading video. I'm taking people through the Bible in 1 year. If you've never read the Bible in a year, come on this journey with us. Only 2% of Christians have ever read their Bible through from cover to cover in 12 months. Why don't you come on this journey with us? Subscribe and you'll get the daily notification.